All right, so Kernza is intermediate wheatgrass, which if you're a cattle guy or you have CRP, you might know that as a forage, and you're absolutely right. Intermediate wheatgrass has been around for decades as a forage. But in the last 20 years, there's been an effort by breeders to push it as a perennial grain. And so breeders have increased the seed size about 3 times, and the yield somewhere in the 2 to 3 times neighborhood, to make lines that are now known as Kernza. And so it's still intermediate wheatgrass, but it's intermediate wheatgrass lines that have been bred for bigger seed size, higher seed yield, and they're working on free threshing and anti-shatter. It is still a small seed, and it still has a hull on it, which, for a processor is a drawback. This is clean Kernza grain, so there is still that added dehulling process that either a buyer or that processor is going to have to go through to get it into a usable feed product. The seed is currently about 1/3 of the weight of most of our winter wheats and spring wheats, so it's still got a ways to go. The breeder he's optimistic that they can get it up to wheat size in about 5 to 10 years, but still an up-and-coming thing. If you're interested in the plants, you're welcome to come up here and rip some out. This is Kernza that was planted in the greenhouse in Fargo about a month ago on January 5th. And then for comparison, this is winter wheat, variety Jerry, that was planted on the same day. So I'll take that down. Just kind of the point that it is a perennial. It's a pretty small seedling to start. It takes a little while to get going, certainly in comparison to our annual crops that have been bred extensively for getting out of the ground really quickly. But that said, after a couple months of good growing conditions, Kernza does get to be a pretty robust plant. This is Kernza that was planted on December 6th, again in the greenhouse, so optimal. But it does get to be a pretty beefy plant. It's not truly sod forming. It doesn't really have rhizomes, so you won't end up with a lawn. But it can fill in, and you can kind of lose the rows after a year or two. It does need to vernalize, like winter wheat, so it needs to go through the winter to stimulate grain production. And you can either fall seed it or spring seed it. It typically gets better weed control if you fall seed it, because then it has a jump on the annual weeds come spring. I am a fan of seeding it with a nurse crop, so a light grade of oats or barley or peas, both so it helps flow through the drill, but then also just to give it a little bit of ground cover and compete with those weeds while it's establishing. Any questions on sort of the agronomic part of it? Yeah?
If you plant it in the spring, then it won't get cold and vernalize, so you can't harvest it that year?
That's correct. Yep. So if you spring plant, you're going to have to be okay with waiting more than a year for your first harvest. Yep. Whereas if you were to plant it in, say, September, and then you're harvesting the following August. Yep. So that's a drawback, actually.
Is there any possibility of planting it like after an early edible bean crop, being able to harvest a decent amount the next year, or does it have to gain 2-3 years of vegetative growth?
Right, so they actually, typically the highest yield is in that first year of grain harvest. So if you were to, I don't know if you like the term relay cropping, but say seeded after a pea, or I know dry beans certainly gets harvested later than something like pea or lentil. But yes, as long as it's going to get in a good 4 weeks, I guess I'd feel better about 6 weeks, but 4 to 6 weeks before a frost, it should be able to get established enough that then you'll be able to harvest grain the next year. Yeah.
So what are the, let's say, normal yields and price per bushel?
Sure. So in Minnesota and Wisconsin, most farmers are getting 500 to 800 pounds an acre. Put that in perspective of spring wheat. If you had 50 bushels an acre and then 60 pounds a bushel, that's 3,000 pounds. So Kernza is at a fraction of wheat yield currently, so do keep that in mind. Some farmers have been able to hit about 1,000 pounds, but that's the upper end. Out in western North Dakota, we've been getting 300 to 500 pounds an acre, so a little less. Price-wise, about $1 a pound is where it's getting sold for. There isn't currently a bushel weight on it. The breeder's best guess, the bushel weight is maybe something in the 28 to 30 pound neighborhood. Again, that real light, fluffy seed with a hull on it. So then, I feel like that's a good transition. I'll pass this around in case folks haven't seen it. But if you Google Kernza, a picture that comes up is from the Land Institute, because you might be thinking like, gosh, if this, yeah, it's a perennial, but if it's only yielding 500, 800 pounds an acre, why is it going to be excited? The excitement for Kernza really comes from its perennial nature. It roots 10 to 15 feet deep. It's pretty drought tolerant. It doesn't need a lot of nitrogen. And so there's a lot of excitement around it as, call it a climate-friendly food crop, or companies that are looking to have a grain that they can say is, helping reduce their carbon footprint, or have a product that fits that environmentally friendly kind of marketing niche.
Can it tolerate salty soil?
It does have a little bit of salt tolerance to it. We haven't done the trials to figure out how salt tolerant. My guess is it's probably a little bit better than barley, but it's probably not as good as something like tall wheatgrass or green wheatgrass, those species that we know we plant in a saline seed if we had it. Let's see. I feel like that's good. I know we're on a tight schedule, so I'll just transition to the fun part. If you'd like to eat something, I have samples of Kernza cereal and also some crackers made with Kernza, if you're interested. So on that marketing side, it's mostly being direct marketed to the end user at this point. There's a group in Minnesota called Perennial Pantry. They are direct contracting, buying it off the farm. They clean it, dehull it, mill it, and they're making flour, pancake mixes, some other products like that. So very small supply chains is where Kernza is. The biggest end user of Kernza currently is General Mills. They came out with this cereal just late last year. And it's not pure Kernza. There is wheat and oats and honey and other stuff in here. But they are buying their Kernza through Healthy Food Ingredients. That's a specialty food ingredient company that they're based in South Dakota, but they do have delivery points in North Dakota and Minnesota. And they're actually receiving Kernza in Valley City, North Dakota, and cleaning it and dehulling it there. And they're the supplier that's getting it to General Mills. So there are larger end users interested in Kernza, but there's only about 4,000 acres total of Kernza in the country right now. So it's more limited by supply than demand.
So what other places can dehull? Any place close to here?
So Valley City, North Dakota, Perennial Pantry does their own. They're really small. I think it's Stengel Grains. They're in northern South Dakota, might be Watertown. They work with it. But other than that, I don't know. It is a little bit of a bear to dehull. It does better with an impact type dehuller than like rolling. So certainly like HFI, the Health Food Ingredients, they're contracted with General Mills to set up a facility specifically for Kernza.
What is this cereal? Just Climate Smart? Is that what this is?
Yep, that's what this is. Yep. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of on that supply chain side. General Mills attempted to Kernza cereal a few years ago, if you ever saw this box out there. But a few years ago, there was only about 2,000 acres of Kernza in production. So they only made something like 5,000 boxes of this cereal and did it as a limited edition, just because there wasn't enough Kernza out there to distribute it more widely. If you're, yeah.
What's the reason for people wanting to eat Kernza?
That's a great question. I think it's because there's a lot of consumers out there that want to make food purchases that they feel are supporting environmental goals, things like improved water quality or reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture, things like that. In Minnesota, the state of Minnesota has supported Kernza in waterhead, or what do they call them? Water well protection areas. So in the central part of the state where there's some sandy soils and shallow aquifers that are used for drinking water, the state of Minnesota has supported the planting of Kernza over some of those aquifers is it's very good at drawing out nitrates and keeping that out of groundwater. And so that alone has been like a marketing point for like Perennial planter. Like, support water quality in rural Minnesota by purchasing this plow.
Okay, we gotta move on. Thank you, very good.
Oh, okay.